One of the most emotionally confusing experiences a person can go through is loving someone who slowly becomes less emotionally available the safer the relationship becomes. At first, nothing feels wrong. In fact, the connection often feels unusually deep in the beginning. They seem emotionally invested, attentive, curious about every part of you. The way they open up feels rare and meaningful because avoidant individuals usually do not connect emotionally with people very easily. So when they finally let their walls down around you even slightly, it creates the feeling that something profoundly special is unfolding between you both. You feel chosen, trusted, emotionally significant to them, and because those vulnerable moments feel so genuine, you naturally assume the relationship is slowly becoming stronger and more secure over time. But what many people do not realize is that for avoidance, the early stages of connection often feel safer precisely because there is still uncertainty involved. There is still emotional distance, still room to escape if vulnerability starts becoming overwhelming. In those early moments, intimacy feels temporary enough that they can emotionally manage it without fully confronting their deeper fears surrounding dependence and closeness. The real shift begins the moment emotional permanence enters the relationship. The moment they subconsciously realize that you are deeply attached, that you are not leaving, that you will continue understanding their distance, forgiving their inconsistency, and fighting for the relationship even while they slowly stop nurturing it with the same emotional energy they once did. And when that realization settles into their nervous system, something painful often begins happening beneath the surface of the relationship. Not always because they intentionally want to hurt you, not because they are necessarily cruel or malicious people, but because emotional safety affects avoidance differently than it affects most people. For emotionally secure individuals, safety deepens intimacy. It creates closeness, openness, emotional relaxation. But for many avoidants, emotional safety can trigger emotional deactivation instead. The more certain they become that someone will stay, the more their fear of emotional dependency quietly begins surfacing. Suddenly, the person who once pursued closeness starts withdrawing from it. The warmth becomes inconsistent, the affection feels unpredictable, emotional effort slowly fades, and you sit there trying to understand what changed, replaying conversations inside your head, wondering if perhaps you became too emotional, too available, too patient, or too loving. But the truth is far more complicated than most people realize. Once an avoidant becomes emotionally certain that you are not leaving, they often stop managing the fear of losing you and start managing the fear of needing you. That fear changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. Because avoidant attachment is deeply connected to emotional self-protection, many avoidants learned very early in life that vulnerability created pain, disappointment, rejection, overwhelm, or emotional shame, so they adapted by suppressing emotional needs, disconnecting from vulnerability, and maintaining emotional independence at all costs. During the beginning of relationships, they can temporarily override these defenses because uncertainty keeps their nervous system emotionally engaged. The possibility of losing you activates pursuit, desire, attention, and emotional investment, but certainty changes the emotional equation. Once the relationship starts feeling permanent, deeper fears begin rising to the surface again. Fear of losing independence, fear of emotional engulfment, fear of becoming dependent on someone emotionally, fear that another person now holds the power to deeply hurt them. And instead of communicating these fears openly, many avoidants cope unconsciously through emotional distance. Not obvious distance at first, small changes, subtle withdrawal, less reassurance, less emotional vulnerability, less consistency, less effort, and because these changes happen gradually, you often adapt to them instead of immediately recognizing them for what they are. At first, you explain the behavior away. You tell yourself they are stressed, busy, overwhelmed, dealing with something internally. And sometimes they genuinely are. But over time, you start noticing a painful pattern forming beneath the surface. The more loyal and emotionally committed you become, the less emotionally present they seem to become in return. The more understanding and patient you are, the more emotionally relaxed they become about neglecting the relationship. Slowly, without realizing it, you begin carrying the emotional weight of the connection almost entirely by yourself. And this is the part nobody prepares you for. Because when avoidants realize someone is deeply attached, some unconsciously begin testing how much emotional inconsistency that person will tolerate before finally walking away. not necessarily through obvious manipulation, but through withdrawal, silence, emotional unpredictability, and distance. And the devastating thing is that these behaviors often strengthen attachment instead of weakening it, because inconsistent affection creates psychological instability inside the nervous system. Your brain starts chasing emotional relief. One warm conversation suddenly feels incredibly meaningful. One affectionate moment feels intoxicating. One emotionally vulnerable interaction feels like proof that the connection is finally returning. So you keep holding on. You keep waiting for the emotionally available version of them from the beginning to come back permanently. What many people fail to understand is that intermittent affection creates one of the strongest emotional addictions a human being can experience, because unpredictability keeps the nervous system hyper-focused on the relationship. You stop feeling emotionally secure and start feeling emotionally hungry instead, and hunger changes everything. Your emotional energy no longer revolves around naturally experiencing love. It becomes centered around maintaining closeness and preventing distance. You begin overthinking constantly, analyzing texts, monitoring their tone, watching their emotional availability fluctuate day by day, trying to predict whether today will be the warm version of them or the emotionally distant version. And slowly, almost without noticing it happening, you begin abandoning yourself emotionally in order to preserve the relationship. That is where the darkest part of the cycle truly begins, because once someone realizes you will continue staying despite inconsistency, your loyalty unintentionally removes emotional consequences from their withdrawal. They stop fearing disconnection the same way you do. You become the one carrying the anxiety, initiating emotional repair, and trying to restore closeness after every period of distance. Over time, this creates a painful imbalance of emotional power inside the relationship. One person becomes emotionally reactive, the other becomes emotionally avoidant. One chases connection while the other controls intimacy through withdrawal. And the painful thing is that many avoidants do not even fully realize they are doing this. To them, withdrawal feels regulating, distance feels calming, space feels safer than sustained intimacy. But to the person loving them, the emotional impact becomes devastating, because you begin feeling emotionally abandoned while technically still inside the relationship. You start mourning the connection even while the relationship itself continues existing. And that kind of loneliness is incredibly difficult to explain unless someone has personally lived through it. You can spend hours beside someone and still feel emotionally invisible. You can sleep next to someone and still feel emotionally disconnected. You can love someone deeply while constantly feeling uncertain whether they are emotionally present with you at all. And the more emotionally deprived you become, the more powerful their moments of affection start feeling. That is what creates the trap. The relationship slowly stops operating on consistent love and starts operating on emotional relief instead. You become grateful for basic emotional presence. Tiny moments of reassurance suddenly feel enormous because your nervous system has been deprived for so long. And this is where many people lose themselves completely, because instead of questioning why love suddenly feels emotionally exhausting, they start trying harder to earn the connection back. They become more patient, more understanding, more self-sacrificing. They silence their own emotional needs to avoid triggering withdrawal. They avoid difficult conversations, suppress pain, minimize themselves emotionally, convince themselves that if they can just love correctly enough, eventually the inconsistency will disappear. But unfortunately, that strategy usually deepens the imbalance rather than healing it. Because every time emotional neglect is tolerated without boundaries, the relationship unconsciously adapts around that tolerance. Eventually, the avoidant partner may stop viewing emotional effort as necessary for maintaining the relationship, not because they do not care, but because the connection no longer feels emotionally at risk to them. And that is why so many people describe these relationships as emotionally draining, rather than emotionally fulfilling. Not because love never existed, but because love became tangled together with uncertainty, deprivation, inconsistency, and emotional survival. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that many people stay trapped inside this cycle for years because they keep remembering who the avoidant was in the beginning. The affectionate version, the emotionally available version, the deeply connected version. They keep believing that person still exists somewhere underneath the distance and fear, and sometimes they do. But unless the avoidant becomes self-aware enough to confront their fear of intimacy and emotional avoidance patterns directly, the cycle often repeats endlessly. Push, pull, warmth, distance, connection, withdrawal, hope, confusion. again and again, until eventually the other person no longer recognizes themselves emotionally. Because loving someone who fears intimacy often turns love into emotional survival instead of emotional peace. And eventually, after carrying the emotional weight of the relationship for so long, something inside you begins asking a deeply painful question. How much of yourself are you slowly losing, trying to keep someone emotionally close who only knows how to love safely from a distance? And the painful truth is that by the time you finally begin asking yourself those difficult questions, a large part of you is already emotionally exhausted, not because you stopped loving them, but because loving them slowly started requiring you to betray your own emotional needs just to keep the connection alive. You became more careful with your words, more cautious with your emotions, more aware of their moods than your own. You started measuring when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to ask for reassurance, and when to suppress your pain because you feared pushing them even further away. Slowly, without fully realizing it, the relationship stopped feeling like a space where two people could safely exist emotionally. It started feeling like emotional survival instead. You adapted yourself around their avoidance. You learned how to tolerate silence, how to normalize emotional distance, how to convince yourself that bare minimum affection was enough to keep holding on. And the terrifying thing is that this adjustment happens so gradually that many people do not even realize how emotionally deprived they have become until much later. Human beings can adapt emotionally to almost anything when attachment becomes strong enough, even inconsistency, even neglect, even loneliness, especially when occasional moments of closeness continue giving them hope that the connection is still alive underneath all the distance. That is why breadcrumbing becomes one of the most psychologically confusing experiences inside avoidant relationships. Not because the affection itself is fake, but because it arrives inconsistently enough to keep emotional certainty permanently out of reach. One day they seem emotionally warm again, present again, emotionally engaged again. You feel relief flood through your body because for a brief moment it feels like the relationship is finally returning to what it once was. Then suddenly the distance returns, the replies become shorter, the emotional energy disappears again. The connection starts feeling cold without explanation, and because the warmth felt real, you convince yourself that the distance must only be temporary. So you keep waiting, keep hoping, keep emotionally investing into moments instead of patterns. That is what makes the cycle so dangerous. Your nervous system becomes conditioned to chase emotional relief rather than emotional stability. You are no longer experiencing secure love. You are experiencing emotional unpredictability mixed with attachment. Over time, that creates a very painful internal transformation. You stop focusing on whether your emotional needs are actually being met and start focusing entirely on how to avoid losing the connection. That shift changes everything psychologically because once fear enters love, self-abandonment often follows shortly behind it. You begin over-explaining yourself constantly, trying to prove your intentions, trying to show loyalty, trying to make them feel emotionally safe enough to stop withdrawing from you. Every time they pull away, you feel responsible for restoring closeness again. You become the emotional caretaker of the relationship, the emotional stabilizer, the emotional pursuer, while they slowly become more passive emotionally, because somewhere deep down they subconsciously know you will continue carrying the relationship, no matter how distant they become. That is why emotional withdrawal becomes such a powerful form of control inside these dynamics. Not always intentional control, but psychological control nonetheless, because silence creates anxiety, distance creates obsession, uncertainty creates hyperfocus. The less emotionally available they become, the more emotionally consumed you often become trying to reconnect with them. Eventually, your entire emotional world starts revolving around their availability. Your mood changes depending on their attention. Your peace depends on their reassurance. Your sense of emotional safety becomes attached to whether they are emotionally warm or emotionally cold that day. And at that point, it is no longer healthy attachment anymore. It is emotional dependency slowly being built through inconsistency. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that many avoidants genuinely do care about the people they are hurting. But caring about someone and having the emotional capacity to sustain intimacy consistently are not always the same thing. Someone can love you deeply and still lack the emotional tools required to maintain closeness in a healthy way. Someone can fear losing you while simultaneously fearing intimacy itself. And that contradiction creates enormous emotional confusion for the person trying to love them. Because you constantly receive mixed signals. At times they seem deeply attached to you. At times they seem emotionally unreachable. At times they crave closeness. At times they appear suffocated by it. So you remain trapped, trying to decode which version of them is the real one, the loving version or the distant version. But the painful reality is that both versions are real. That is what makes avoidant attachment so emotionally destabilizing. The warmth is real, the fear is also real, and unless those fears are consciously confronted, the relationship becomes trapped inside an endless push-pull cycle, where intimacy itself starts triggering emotional retreat. This becomes especially painful after moments of deep emotional closeness. Many people notice that the more emotionally intimate the relationship becomes, the colder the avoidance suddenly acts afterward. After vulnerable conversations, after emotional bonding, after affectionate weekends together, after moments where the love felt deepest, suddenly the distance appears again, and this confuses people enormously because intimacy normally strengthens connection in healthy relationships. But for avoidance, intimacy often activates unconscious fear instead. The closer they feel emotionally, the more exposed they feel internally. The more vulnerable they become, the more their nervous system starts searching for emotional escape routes again. So after moments of closeness, withdrawal becomes their way of regulating emotional overwhelm, not because the intimacy meant nothing to them, but because it meant too much. Unfortunately, the partner usually interprets this withdrawal personally. They assume they did something wrong, said too much, needed too much, loved too deeply, so they begin shrinking themselves emotionally to avoid triggering distance again. They stop expressing needs openly, stop asking difficult questions, stop bringing up emotional pain. They become quieter emotionally because they fear honesty itself will create more withdrawal. Over time, the relationship becomes emotionally imbalanced in a devastating way. One person adapts by suppressing themselves, while the other adapts by distancing themselves. Neither person feels truly emotionally safe anymore, but only one person is usually fighting desperately to hold the connection together. Eventually, the loneliness inside this dynamic becomes impossible to ignore. Not loud loneliness, but quiet loneliness, the kind that hides behind routines, conversations, text messages, and shared experiences. You may still technically spend time together, still communicate daily, still remain committed to one another, but emotionally something feels painfully absent. You stop feeling emotionally seen, emotionally prioritized, emotionally held. Because avoidants often struggle expressing emotional depth consistently, many partners begin starving emotionally inside relationships that still exist on the surface. That kind of loneliness changes people slowly. You become more anxious, more emotionally sensitive, more reactive to small changes in energy. You begin constantly searching for reassurance that the connection is still emotionally secure. And when reassurance finally does come, you cling to it tightly, because emotionally, you have been deprived for so long. This is why so many deeply empathetic people become trapped in avoidant dynamics for years. Empathy convinces them to keep understanding the pain behind the behavior instead of protecting themselves from the impact of the behavior. They see the wounds underneath the avoidance, the fear underneath the distance, the unresolved pain underneath the inconsistency. And because they genuinely care, they continue giving more patience, more understanding, more emotional labor, hoping that eventually enough love will help the avoidant feel safe enough to stop running from intimacy. But love alone cannot heal avoidance. Awareness heals it. Accountability heals it. Willingness to confront emotional patterns heals it. And many people lose years of their lives waiting for someone to become emotionally available without realizing that emotional availability cannot be forced through loyalty alone. You cannot love someone into healing if they remain emotionally committed to avoidance. Perhaps the saddest part of all is that the longer this cycle continues, the more your identity slowly becomes organized around the relationship itself. You stop asking yourself what you need emotionally and start asking how to prevent distance, how to avoid conflict, how to maintain connection, how to stop triggering withdrawal. Eventually, you become emotionally disconnected from your own inner reality. Your focus becomes entirely external, centered around their moods, their availability, their responses, and their emotional presence. That is why people often feel completely shattered when these relationships finally end, not simply because they lost someone they loved, but because somewhere inside the process, they lost themselves too. And the truly devastating thing is that many avoidants do not fully understand the emotional damage being created while it is happening. From their perspective, they are simply trying to regulate discomfort, trying to create space, trying to avoid overwhelm. But from the other side of the relationship, the experience feels like slowly loving someone who keeps disappearing emotionally every time the connection starts becoming real. After enough cycles of this, something inside you eventually begins changing, not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. You begin realizing that no matter how much love you offer someone, you cannot build emotional safety alone while the other person keeps building emotional walls. And when that realization finally begins settling into your awareness, something painful starts becoming impossible to ignore. You slowly begin understanding that you have been fighting for emotional closeness with someone who only feels emotionally safe when intimacy remains partially out of reach, and that contradiction quietly destroys the relationship from the inside over time. Because no matter how patient you become, no matter how deeply you love, and no matter how much understanding you offer, true intimacy cannot fully exist with someone who keeps retreating every time emotional connection starts becoming too real. Eventually, exhaustion begins replacing hope, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. You wake up one day and realize your nervous system has been living in survival mode for far too long. You feel emotionally tired constantly, not simply because of arguments or conflict, but because uncertainty itself is exhausting. Never fully knowing where you stand emotionally with someone slowly drains the spirit in ways most people cannot even explain. You become mentally preoccupied, emotionally hyper-alert, constantly reading between lines, trying to detect emotional shifts before they happen. After enough time inside this cycle, many people stop feeling like themselves entirely. Their confidence weakens, their emotional stability weakens, even their ability to trust their own perception begins collapsing because inconsistent love creates internal confusion. One part of you remembers the warmth while another part cannot ignore the neglect. One moment you feel deeply loved, and the next moment you feel emotionally abandoned. The mind struggles to reconcile those two realities at the same time. That is why people often remain trapped in these relationships much longer than they ever expected. Not because the relationship is consistently healthy, but because it remains emotionally confusing enough to keep hope alive. And hope becomes dangerous when it keeps you emotionally attached to pain that no longer feels sustainable. Eventually, many people stop asking themselves whether the relationship actually feels healthy and start asking only one question instead: does the avoidant still love me? And that question alone reveals how much emotional damage has already occurred. Because healthy love does not leave you constantly questioning your emotional worth. Healthy love does not make affection feel scarce. Healthy love does not force you to emotionally starve while begging yourself to remain patient. But inside avoidant dynamics, people slowly become conditioned to accept emotional inconsistency as normal. Once that conditioning becomes deep enough, they begin tolerating things they never imagined they would tolerate before. Emotional neglect, disappearing acts, lack of reassurance, coldness after intimacy, long periods of emotional distance, minimal effort, unclear commitment, and every time these behaviors continue without consequences, the avoidant unconsciously becomes more emotionally comfortable, maintaining the same patterns because human beings naturally adapt to what continues being tolerated. That is why boundaries become so important inside relationships with avoidance, not as punishment, not as emotional games, but as protection against slowly losing yourself while trying to maintain connection with someone who struggles maintaining emotional presence. Unfortunately, many people only learn this after they are already emotionally burned out. After months or years spent trying to prove their love, trying to earn consistency, trying to become emotionally safe enough for the avoidant to finally stop withdrawing. But avoidance is not healed by another person becoming smaller. It is not healed through self-sacrifice, and it is not healed through endless emotional pursuit. In fact, the more one person abandons themselves to preserve the relationship, the more emotionally imbalanced the dynamic often becomes. Eventually, the avoidant stops experiencing the relationship as emotionally fragile. Subconsciously, they begin assuming you will remain there regardless of how inconsistent the connection becomes. That is the moment where emotional complacency quietly enters the relationship. Not necessarily cruelty, not necessarily malicious intent, but complacency. The emotional effort decreases because the fear of losing you decreases. And when someone no longer fears losing the connection, they often stop investing the same energy into protecting it emotionally. That realization hurts deeply because it forces you to confront something painful. Your loyalty may have unintentionally removed the urgency for emotional growth inside the relationship. The more you tolerated, the less pressure existed for change. And the heartbreaking thing is that most people tolerated everything because they genuinely loved the person. They were trying to save the relationship, trying to prove commitment, trying to show unconditional care. But unconditional tolerance and healthy love are not the same thing. Love without boundaries eventually turns into self-erasure. Over time, that self-erasure creates enormous psychological consequences. Many people leave avoidant relationships carrying emotional wounds they did not have before. They become anxious in future relationships, fearful of emotional distance, hypersensitive to communication changes, terrified of abandonment, constantly seeking reassurance, because prolonged emotional inconsistency trains the nervous system to remain alert for rejection at all times. Even after the relationship ends, the body often continues carrying the emotional memory of unpredictability. That is why healing from these relationships can take so long. Not because the love was fake, but because the instability became deeply wired into the nervous system itself. Perhaps one of the hardest realizations of all is recognizing how much of your life slowly became centered around someone else's emotional availability. Your peace depended on their warmth. Your confidence depended on their reassurance. Your emotional state depended on whether they were emotionally close or emotionally distant that day. At that point, love is no longer functioning freely. Attachment has quietly transformed into emotional dependency. And eventually, somewhere deep inside you, a quiet awakening begins happening. You start recognizing how much emotional energy has been spent trying to hold together a connection that only survives because you are carrying most of the emotional labor alone. You realize you have been carrying conversations, carrying repair, carrying vulnerability, carrying emotional responsibility for two people. Slowly, exhaustion begins outweighing hope, and that moment usually becomes the true turning point. Not anger, not revenge, not sudden detachment, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that appears after loving someone for too long without ever truly feeling emotionally safe inside the relationship. Strangely enough, this is often the exact moment the avoidant suddenly begins reacting differently. Because avoidants frequently become most emotionally activated when they sense emotional distance coming from you instead of from themselves. As long as they feel emotionally in control of the connection, their nervous system remains relatively calm. But when they sense you emotionally pulling away, something shifts internally. Suddenly they become more attentive, more curious, more emotionally present, sometimes even more affectionate than they have been in a very long time. And this confuses people deeply, because it feels like the avoidant is finally becoming the person they always wanted them to be. But psychologically, what is often happening is that emotional pursuit has simply reversed. Now the avoidant feels uncertainty again. Now they fear emotional loss again. And uncertainty reactivates emotional attention inside them. That is why so many people become trapped inside painful on and off cycles with avoidance. The moment they finally begin detaching emotionally, the avoidant moves closer again. The moment closeness returns, the avoidant retreats again. Push, pull, distance, reconnection, over and over again. Unless both people consciously recognize the cycle, it can continue repeating for years. That is why one of the most powerful moments in healing occurs when someone finally stops chasing emotional reassurance from the avoidant entirely. Not as manipulation, not as strategy, but from genuine emotional exhaustion. Eventually, the nervous system reaches a limit where survival mode no longer feels sustainable, and inside that space, something important begins happening. Your emotional focus slowly starts returning back to yourself. You begin noticing how much anxiety you normalized, how much loneliness you minimized, how much emotional pain you justified simply because you loved them. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, you begin asking yourself a completely different question, not whether they will finally choose you emotionally, but whether you are finally ready to choose yourself, because real love was never supposed to feel like constantly fighting for emotional presence. Real love was never supposed to make you feel emotionally invisible. Real love was never supposed to require abandoning your own needs simply to keep someone from pulling away. Healthy love feels emotionally safe, consistent, and reciprocal. You do not have to constantly decode it. You do not have to repeatedly earn basic reassurance. You do not have to shrink your emotions to maintain peace. And many people only fully understand this after spending years trapped inside emotionally unavailable dynamics that slowly taught them to confuse anxiety with connection. But anxiety is not intimacy, emotional chasing is not love, and surviving emotional inconsistency is not proof of soul-level connection. Sometimes it is simply proof that your heart kept holding on long after your spirit started breaking underneath the weight of uncertainty. And eventually, after enough emotional exhaustion and confusion, you begin realizing that what kept you attached was not only love, it was hope. Hope that one day they would fully open their heart, that the inconsistency would disappear, and that the warmth you felt in the beginning would finally become permanent. But hope can keep people emotionally attached to pain far longer than they realize. You hold on to the vulnerable moments, the rare affection, and the brief glimpses of emotional closeness because they feel meaningful enough to make you believe change is still possible. And over time, your nervous system becomes addicted not just to the person, but to the emotional relief their affection occasionally provides after long periods of distance. Eventually, though, reality becomes impossible to ignore. You realize you have been loving someone for who they could become, while silently suffering from who they currently are emotionally. That realization changes everything. You stop asking whether the connection feels intense and start asking whether it feels emotionally sustainable. Because intensity can exist inside unhealthy dynamics, but healthy love requires consistency, emotional safety, accountability, and mutual effort. And when those things are missing for too long, you slowly lose yourself trying to preserve the connection. Many people leave these relationships emotionally drained because they spent so much time neglecting their own needs, suppressing their feelings, and blaming themselves for someone else's inability to sustain intimacy. But avoidance is not caused by loving someone too much. It comes from unresolved fear surrounding vulnerability and closeness, and no amount of loyalty can heal someone who remains emotionally committed to avoidance. Healing begins the moment you stop romanticizing inconsistency and start seeing the relationship clearly. You begin understanding that healthy love should feel calm, safe, and emotionally steady, not confusing, anxious, or emotionally exhausting. Real intimacy does not require constant chasing, decoding, or fighting for reassurance, and eventually you realize that choosing yourself does not mean you stopped loving them. It simply means you finally started loving yourself too. Because the hardest but most important truth is this: you cannot heal emotional abandonment by continuously abandoning yourself for someone else.